Welcome to the Office Latte podcast, where we go beyond the boardroom to explore new conversations on life and career. I'm Erin Kennedy, CEO of Professional Resume Services and wife, mother, sister, daughter, aunt, and friend. Now, let's dive in. Hey, Summer.
Hello, Erin. How's it going this morning?
This afternoon, it is great. How's my favorite Gen Z correspondent doing over there?
I'm doing well. I had my coffee.
Gen Z / millennial. Right?
Yeah, I'm drinking another mocha with oat milk this morning.
Well, that sounds super healthy and yummy. I'm drinking water.
Okay.
Water from my refrigerator. Well, we're on a well. Yeah. So I do prefer refrigerator water because it comes through a filter, so it doesn't taste so much like well. It tastes a little less like pipes and more like, clean, delicious water.
I love that.
Anyways, I know we were talking a little bit before about our toxic work environments that we've been in early on. I know I had one, when I was in sales and they would pit us against each other and it was like dog eat dog. It was terrible. And I know you were talking about one as well.
Oh yeah, I've totally had my fair share of toxic work cultures. Whether it's the culture is just overall bad or like toxic people, because I think there's such a difference. So I'm excited to hear our guest. Talk about the kind of difference. Yeah.
So our guest, Jennifer Brick, your career bestie, she really is amazing. I've been following her, on LinkedIn for at least 5 years, I think. And then she, it got into video, and I was still like slogging behind doing my little written posts, and she just kind of took off. She has an amazing following on YouTube and TikTok and Instagram, but she really gets to the heart of toxic workplaces and how to get yourself out of them. So I am looking forward to, digging into that and just getting some answers. Sometimes you can't leave. So then what do you do?
Yeah. And just sometimes I feel like you get into a culture where you feel like you can't trust anyone. And that's like so scary. Like, I don't even know what's worse. Like, one bad, awful manager who kind of controls your whole job, or like everyone is mildly bad. It's like, like I've been in those places where I'm like, how is everyone?
You don't trust anyone. I mean, you just can't trust anyone because it's so, it's so bad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I'm excited though. It's going to be a good combo, and I just feel like she has so much experience in this. And like you said, with her following kind of represents why she's so good, because what she says just resonates with everyone who's ever been in a toxic workplace, or if you're, switching jobs, kind of what to look for.
Yeah. I'm going to read her bio because I think it explains, better than I can about, how she got started. But Jennifer Brick is your new career bestie. After climbing the career ladder in the tech industry, she discovered her true purpose in life was to help people succeed at work. In 2019, she started a YouTube channel that focused on everything from navigating career advancement to dealing with coworker drama and getting over a toxic job. She is the author of Career Glow Up and an award-winning YouTube channel, and her advice has also been featured in publications like Fast Company, Business Insider, and Newsweek. So that's her bio, and like I said, I've been so excited to talk with her about all of this, and what do you do? I know, like I said, I'll tell her my brief little story, but it was a really toxic environment, one where I actually lost my hair on the top of my head, and it was pretty bad. So, which I didn't realize how bad it was at the time. I just knew it was stressful, but until I went to the hairdresser and they're like, "Oh, what happened? You've lost your hair's missing here." And I was like, "What?" I have thick hair, especially back then. I had really thick hair, 80s, 90s hair. It'll help from the perms, but. But anyways, that was an eye-opener, and I vowed after that never to be in another toxic work environment. I didn't even know what it was considered back then. It was just I knew I didn't want to be in it again. So anyways, without further ado, let's jump in. Jennifer Brick. I am so glad you're here.
I'm so excited to be here talking to you today, Erin.
Good, good. I was telling Summer before the show how I said I've been following you for maybe 5 years, 4 or 5 years on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
And then you had your like huge video domination. and I said, I was telling Summer I'm still, on my keyboard, and you're like killing it with video and all about the toxic work environment, and which is just one of the most important topics I see in the workforce. So anyways, I let's just dive in. So tell me, how did you get into this? How did toxic work environments become your specialty?
So my career, like everyone, I love asking people about their careers because everyone has such a unique story. Like where you think that you're headed at point A never ends up being where you end up, right?
Right.
So I worked a corporate career for 13, 15 years, kind of in preparation to eventually start my own company. I always knew that I wanted to be an entrepreneur. I knew that like being an employee wasn't like my end game, but I wanted to learn how to be an entrepreneur on someone else's dime. And I very much got to the point in my corporate career that I realized I was done. The way that I always summarize it is I was done making rich white dudes richer, because I was working in tech, I was working in startups, and it was so much fun and it had so much impact. But like, really, that's what I was doing, was building multi-million-dollar businesses for other people. So I was like, okay, I'm going to go do this for myself. And I left my corporate career. I didn't quite know what that company was going to look like because I had about 20 different ideas, very excited to run with all of them. But the one that really stood out was starting a YouTube channel, which is not a typical move to leave like an executive role in tech to start a YouTube channel. So I knew I wanted to start the channel. I was like, well, what can I talk about? What's something that no one else is talking about, that I have experience, that I have expertise? And unfortunately, in one of the jobs that I had been in a severely toxic work environment. And I had been in environments that weren't necessarily built for me, weren't necessarily meant for me, but I had like learned the rules to navigate. So I knew that the channel needed to be about that. And as soon as I started talking about toxic workplaces, it resonated with people. And I think it's because so many people have been through it. So many people are going through it. And I know when I left my toxic job, like that term did not exist in like the like regular vernacular. I had never heard of it. So I didn't understand the experience at all. So I'm glad to see that, obviously the awareness of toxic work culture is rising and conversations is rising. But my unique spot is like I talk about how to get your career back on track after it, which no one else was doing. And I mean, there's still very few people that do that.
Yeah. It's so, and I love that. And I love what you talk about because it is so easy. Well, number one, to be stuck, but then what, and so how would you describe, excuse me, what is your description and how would you define a toxic work environment?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Okay. Do you want the long answer or do you want the short answer, Erin? Because this is something I can rant about. I think like a lot of the ways that we talk about workplace toxicity really comes down to like signs and symptoms. So like, here's the 10 signs that your job is toxic. I've definitely made that video multiple times. But the thing is that when it comes to the signs and the symptoms, I could sit here right now and rattle probably 200 dynamics that I hear about on a very regular basis that are toxic in the workplace. But if we actually look at those behaviors, if we look at those dynamics, the thing is that they exist everywhere and they're not always toxic. So an example I always love to talk about is workplace gossip, because we think that gossip is bad, but gossip is just communicating information. Gossip itself is neutral. It's the intention and what is being talked about and how it's being utilized or if it's being weaponized. Right. So, these things exist everywhere. So I think what I always talk to people about is we need to take it a layer deeper, because we can see those signs and we can see those symptoms everywhere, even in the best places to work.
Yeah.
What we need to understand is that when we talk about workplace toxicity, What we're really talking about is workplace trauma. And that's a really big word that everyone cringes when I say trauma because it is like a big, heavy word. But that, we have to call things what they are in order to deal with them.
And it's the truth. It is the truth with some of these. It's horrible. Yeah.
No, and there's like, there's different types. So like, even if we look at trauma in itself, is that, we can have like these large acute traumas, like, war breaking out, like that's a massive acute trauma that is like extremely disruptive to your life. But there's also smaller trauma. So like, if you get into the world of trauma, there's big T and small t is what's discussed. And small t traumas, especially when they are chronic, when they are persistent over time, like this is often the experience in a toxic workplace. Like I have had clients that have been through very severe, things I don't want to talk about because I know that you'll get filtered on platforms if I do. But the more casual, like the more common experience is more to like the day-to-day workplace traumas that you're experiencing. And this comes down to really one of three things. Your needs are not being met at work. Your values are in deep misalignment. This causes a lot of internal distress because we can no longer cognitively rationalize it. Or your workplace is hitting on an existing trauma trigger that you have. And really, it's typically all three. So, and that makes it easier to understand, but it also makes it more complex for us to understand because then it takes more awareness of what we're really experiencing when we don't want to be experiencing the adversity we are, right? No one wants to be in a toxic job.
Yes. And I want to get into existing toxic trauma in a minute. But when you were talking about or existing toxicity in a job, I was telling Summer just a little background. Maybe this is why I like this topic so much. In my early 20s, I was in sales, pharmaceutical sales, and it was pretty toxic. And they would pit us all against each other, wanted us to hate each other, really did. Which backfired because we all loved each other, but it was, we'd be like sneaking around talking and, which was great for us, but it was still so much pressure, so much toxicity from management. And, you don't really realize it. And here's something that we can talk about too, is that I didn't realize it going through it until, I knew it was awful, but you don't realize to the extent until I told Summer this. I went to get my hair done one day and my hairdresser said, "Oh no, what's wrong?" Or "What happened?" And I was like, "What do you mean?" And she's like, "There's a whole chunk of your hair missing, like this big, the top of my head."
Yeah.
And, of course, perms and everything back in those days. I probably didn't notice it, but it was such an aha, such an awakening because I was thinking, what? And they said it's probably stress. Yeah. My uncle was a doctor. He's the one that mentioned that and, or told my mom, but, and so anyways, it was an aha, an awakening moment for me, but I learned from then that I never wanted, anything like that again. I quit like a month and a half later, but you were talking about something that I know you've talked about on your YouTube channel, on your TikTok channel, is why they can be addictive. Why some people, then because you had mentioned, you go to your next job with this existing trauma still there.
Yeah.
But how can it be addictive?
Drama is addictive. There's a reason why we're hooked on reality TV. So,
this seems crazy to me, but I get it. But you're right. I mean, and some people are really drawn towards drama.
Yeah.
We all know people like that. They're like, "Oh, I don't need this drama," but yet they keep bringing it to them. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, neurochemically, drama triggers your dopamine. So you feel good to a certain extent when you, are experiencing drama, especially when you're watching it. I think like it's much more, it's a better experience to watch it like on television.
Yeah.
Versus to be like in the middle of it. Because when you're in the middle of it, now all of a sudden you're you're under threat. Now your cortisol, your adrenaline is spiking. Your nervous system is absolutely going haywire. That's not a fun experience. Like that's the but-um,
Yeah.
not a state. And when you're in a toxic work environment, you're basically living like that. But yeah, the drama is addictive and it's also very normalizing. So one of the things that like I hear so often from people once they leave a toxic job, if they go to their next company and the next company is normal, maybe it's even, dare I say, healthy and positive, they get really bored. Because no one is coming after them. They're not worried about someone like coming and like stabbing them in the back and taking credit for their work or throwing them under the bus. Like the sense of safety is somewhat disarming to them because they're so used to having that activation and then all of the, you know, like internal experiences that go with it. So it takes time to actually readjust after the toxic workplace. But what can also end up happening is that some people subconsciously end up kind of seeking out drama, like hopefully in positive, like in somewhat healthy ways, like reality television.
Right.
But also there's a lot of
drama elsewhere. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, like, go to the real, like, the housewives. Like, that's what they're there for. Like, I personally love nothing better than, like, bad reality TV. Like, my husband makes so much fun of me, but I'm like, no, like, I have to feed my drama llama. It is there. It is hungry, but I need to feed it in a way that, you know, still supports having, like, a healthy, well-adjusted life and, like, relationships.
Yeah.
But the other thing is that also, like, with existing kind of in that drama, in the toxicity, and really in the, like, dysfunction in a toxic workplace, there's a lot of adaptations that you make in order to survive that experience. Like, you know, to minimize your risk of being targeted, to minimize, you know, what you are actually experiencing. So on a subconscious level, a lot of those adaptations, if you don't know what they are and you haven't revealed them, they come with you to the next job as well. And one of the most common adaptations, and I think that this feeds right into that drama, is a lack of trust of other people. So like basically everyone that I have like worked with, have spoken to, that has been in a toxic work environment has experienced a decrease in trust, if not a complete decimation of trust. So if you feel like you can't trust other people, you are going to subconsciously signal that you don't trust them, so they're not going to trust you, because trust is a reciprocal act. So really also like that can also create a lot of drama and tensions as well. Again, like more casual, but then it puts us back into that toxic dynamic that we wanted to escape in the first place.
Oh, I know.
Right? Like it's like a treadmill, like get me off of here.
You know, how does toxicity like this impact an employee's mental health and well-being now and then in the long term? I mean, you know, I know because we're kind of talking about that like baggage that you bring with you, but I mean, you know, how does it affect them now?
Yeah. So psychological and emotional impact is obviously major. Like I'm not a doctor, I'm not a therapist, so I just want to like be very clear before I start talking next. But a lot of the people that I work with have gone to their doctors, and it's something that I actively also encourage a lot of my clients if I notice anything, or if we're having these conversations of so many people that I have worked with have been diagnosed with depression, have been diagnosed with anxiety. Again, this is directly related to the experience. It is a byproduct. If your neurochemicals are all out of whack, like you're going to feel anxiety because your nervous system is shot. You can experience burnout, which is a physiological experience. I have had clients that have been diagnosed with PTSD and CPTSD from toxic work experiences. So there's, you know, some very serious things. And then, you know, some of these things predate the toxic workplace. Some, you know, so I don't want to like fall all the way down that rabbit hole. But, you know, we have to, and I think it's weird though. And I think it's an important question. So I'm glad you asked it, because I think that there is a lot of pressure to get over it when you leave the toxic job. Like I know when I left, I just expected to feel better.
Right.
And then I didn't just feel better. Like I couldn't just brush it off. I couldn't just shake it off. And the support circle that I went to lean on didn't understand my experience. And it wasn't because they're awful people who lack empathy. They just couldn't relate because they had never been in that dynamic. They had never been in a psychologically abusive workplace. They had never been, you know, so then you have this like relation of like, oh, just brush it off. Like it's a bad job. It was an annoying boss. So then you start to like question yourself, especially since gaslighting plays such a big role, like in all kind of realms of this. But that can also perpetuate, you know, the impact. And then even like going to find a therapist or find a healer, because I'm a hippie. So I'm going to like go to some like Reiki things, like finding trauma-informed practitioners listeners, was also like a kind of big journey for me, because I went to talk to people who just, again, like they didn't understand what the experience was. And it's like, well, it's just work. But it's like, yeah, it's just work. But like, we also base our entire identities on work.
It is your whole identity. And when people brush it off and it's like, oh, it's just your job, get over it. And it's like, no, especially when you take it on and your work is your identity. You know?
Yeah. No, and I mean, when I walked into my toxic job, like I loved my work. I worked way too much voluntarily. Like I would volunteer to do something very similar to my job outside of work because I loved my job so much.
Yeah.
I was super passionate and I loved going to work every day. And so to now wake up with dread and not wanting to do what I do, and to all of a sudden feel like start questioning myself doing what I do, when I knew, like intellectually, I knew I was really good at my job and that I was really good at what I did. And I had a lot of external validation of that. But you know, when you're in that dynamic of the constant questioning, you're always trying to like self-rationalize and like get ahead of it. So like it has these lasting impacts. And then, you know, obviously when we talk about the psychological and the emotional impacts, that still shows up to work with you every day until you resolve it. But then it also is going to impact, you know, your career trajectory, your career success after, because a lot, again, the adaptations that you make in order to survive the toxic workplace, if you don't spot them, if you don't like delete them, they're going to follow. And this is something that I think a lot of people aren't really aware of, and I don't see enough people talking about, because that can be what really continues to devastate and can really like prolong the impact of a toxic workplace. So even if you're not in a toxic job, if you're making yourself invisible, you're not going to get the praise that you deserve for your job. You're not going to get the promotions that you want. You're not going to get the pay increases that you deserve. And again, so that then we have this like long lasting effect until we're able to understand and get and unpack those bags and get rid of them.
Right. And that's interesting. I was watching your TikTok, I think it was today or yesterday maybe, about being invisible. And because you don't want anybody to see you, or you don't want them to see you, even though you do. So you're just it's just like a whole
no, I mean, invisibility is protective in a toxic workplace, but it's going to sabotage you in the next one. And ironically, even the invisibility in the toxic workplace can make you more vulnerable in the toxic workplace, because if no one knows who you are, no one knows what you do, no one knows like what values you stand for, then you become a blank canvas for other people to project onto.
Like, what was his name? Millman or whatever in Office Space.
Oh my gosh, yes.
But, you know, he just stayed to himself. And he became invisible. So, which was very toxic for him. So, okay, well, a couple of things. So what can leaders do and executives and, you know, what roles can HR play in addressing these toxic workplace issues?
So again, how long?
I mean, do they ever?
So complicated.
They're supposed to.
But okay, here's the thing. Ultimately, workplace toxicity is enabled or created at the top. Whatever people can get away with will become the status quo. And it is a race to the bottom. So, and I know it's complicated. You know, when we talk about like different executives, different levels of leadership, you know, another TikTok I posted the other day and a conversation I've had with a lot of people lately is, I'm a manager and I'm afraid to leave my toxic job because no one's going to be here to protect my team. And they're the umbrella. Like, how much of a burden is that? And like, how long can you survive? So, you know, if you're like a entry level or a mid-level manager, like you're only able to do so much. Like it really is a decision at the top. And I think this is where companies need to get really clear. What are the values and what does that look like? What does that look like in practice? Have definitions of that. And then that needs to be something that is qualified across the employee life cycle, from recruitment all the way to the exit. So here's a great example. I know that like I feel like in the like 2000s, like transparency was like really the buzz term. And I am someone who like, I don't have a lot of filters. I don't believe, like, I think that information should be freely distributed, and that's how people make decisions and can do great work. And it's something that I need in order to succeed. And I work with one manager who also said that they transparency is one of their core values too. So I'm like, great, this is totally aligned. Like, this is the most important thing to both of us. But what we didn't do is we didn't qualify what transparency meant to us. So transparency for them, it didn't mean that they were proactively making information available. It just meant that they were willing to answer your questions if you asked them specifically enough. It also meant that they would have unfiltered communications, emotionally speaking, which to me, like, that's something different, and in that same work environment, there was another person on the team who I'll describe it as enjoyed having very passionate conversations, but really it was yelling.
Oh.
And, they love to yell at each other. That was how they communicated. They got it out. They got their emotional release. They got what they wanted. For me, that's like something that I'm very uncomfortable with. And I know, most people I say this to, they're like, wow, I don't want that either. But the thing is that dynamic worked for them. And it worked for a lot of other people in the company as well. So for me, that's toxic. For them, that's ideal. And the problem is where a company tries to pretend to be one thing when they're really the other, because they're going to get the wrong people in. And when you get the wrong people in, it's going to be at minimum a bad work experience for them, an unsupportive environment for their needs. Right. So again, this is where we get into like the kind of first thing that I said in terms of workplace toxicity. Are your needs being met? And second, values alignment. These are two really crucial things. And so I think the better that companies understand who they are and can communicate that, and then also incentivizing the behavior that they want to see. And I'm not here to villainize any behavior, because unless you're doing something that is like expressly awful or criminal, everybody has their thing. Right. I'm not the forebearer to say like, this is what you're allowed to do and this is what you're not allowed to do, because like that's right. That's an opinion. It's not a fact. But I think it's the clarity and the forthcomingness in that. Yeah. And then, when a company does see work culture being fostered that isn't in alignment, that's where they need to intervene. Because if they don't intervene and correct that, then again, maybe they didn't create it, but they're enabling it. And when they enable it, it's going to thrive.
Yeah. So what do you think about the whole work family in company?
Yeah. How to gaslight people into loyalty and compliance. Oh,
right. God. How does this contribute to a toxic environment?
I have a few very viral videos about this.
I know.
Long form and short form. You're welcome. So I think that sometimes I want to differentiate. There's a difference between there being a team and individuals that describe a sense of family. Yeah. When they mean that sense of family is they feel respected, they feel included, they feel like they could relate, like people have their backs, like this is generally like, that's a good thing. And it's one thing I think when we have people at the bottom saying it versus it being the first line in a job description and in interviews of like, we're a family, because what we see is that starts to be weaponized. Yeah. And I also see it paired a lot with social isolation, unfortunately. So, you'll do anything for your family. So it's something that can be exploited. So like, I don't want to be like having, family outside of your born family is wrong. No, again, I'm not, right. I'm not my opinions, aren't relevant to individuals, but I think we need to look at, okay, well, what's the purpose of saying that? What does it really mean? And what are you getting out of that statement versus what you're expected to give? Because typically what I see is this being very, very lopsided. So I don't think that your work as a family, I don't think it's healthy, because what ends up happening, even in those like very well-intentioned and organic, like everybody's very close, they spend time together outside of work, all of a sudden, like what happens if the job goes away? Because like, your family can fire you.
Right. They can fire you. Yeah.
And then you have no income. And now you're like losing.
And all your friends are there, the people that you have made friends with. Wow. So that's something else I want to talk about is grief when leaving the job. I mean, like you had said earlier, people expect this just to all be gone, and you go on to the next thing. But there is a sense of grief even in a toxic environment.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And it surprises everyone. No one expects it. So like, I feel like they're leaving a toxic job. Everybody expects to feel relief. They do not expect to feel grief. And there's very few people that are talking about that. And I think it's because most people don't actually even recognize it. But there's a huge amount of grief, because not only are you grieving the relationships that you did have, because even in a toxic work environment, there's probably like the one person, maybe a few, that got you through the day, right? Like they were the person that you could trust. Yeah. They made sure like you knew that you weren't losing it, because they were like, no, like that's really messed up. Like it's not in your head.
Yes.
There's also, you're mourning the opportunity you thought you were getting. Like I said earlier, and I say this all the time, like no one takes a job expecting for it to be toxic.
Right.
You accepted the job because you thought it was a great opportunity. They thought that you were going to support you. You thought that they were going to support your career development. You thought that you were going to thrive, and that is not what happened.
Yeah.
And the thing is that if that is just obvious, you're probably going to bounce pretty quickly. But what happens in these toxic work environments is that there are tiny glimmers of hope, because they have to keep you there. And every time there is that tiny glimmer of hope, it's like, okay, things might change. Maybe my toxic boss will change. Maybe the situation will change. Maybe I'm actually going to get the promotion that they promised to me. But it never actually happens. So there's this huge amount of grief for like what could have been if they didn't suck, to put it bluntly.
Yeah.
But then the biggest thing that I hear from people is, I miss who I was before my toxic job. And this is like something that I really heavily related. Like I mentioned to you, like when before my toxic job, I was like career loving, I was carefree, I was confident. And then post toxic job, I was just like a mess. Like I did not feel good, to like put it lightly. And I really miss that version of me that could really enjoy their work and feel ambitious and connect with people without second guessing every interaction. And what I thought at that point was that person was gone. Like that they were done. I would never feel that way. I didn't realize when I left my toxic job that there was a way to restore that version of myself. And it didn't mean that, I can never work for a company again, because that's not true. It just meant that I had to go inward to get that person back and find the way to like get back to them.
Yeah. And that's what it takes is, okay, so how can employees, well, here's a couple of things. What advice do you have for someone who realizes that they're in a toxic work environment but can't really leave immediately?
Okay. So common. Yeah. Because I mean, let's face it. The system that we're in, most people cannot walk in and quit their jobs tomorrow, because you've got rent to pay, you have student loans, like food's expensive, you have car payments. Like we are bound to our jobs, and most people don't have the luxury to just like walk in and be like, peace. So what can you actually do? So first, I think the most important thing to do is to reconcile that staying is not a long-term option. Because again, when you can't just walk in and quit when something really, really bad happens, that sense of normalcy will start creeping back in, that little glimmer of hope. And it's like, maybe I can just survive it. Yeah. You need to resolve that this is not going to change. It's not going to get better. You need to get out. And then I'm a huge advocate for organizing systems to get you there. Because the biggest prohibitor for leaving a toxic job, well, really there's two. First, your confidence is probably in the toilet, because you're constantly getting negative input about who you are, your job performance, your impact. Like you're constantly being questioned. You start to question yourself. But the second thing is, at the end of dealing, like you've had a toxic job. You know how exhausting it is to put up with that BS all day. Right. Oh, and so at the end of the day, you were just tapped. Like you were emotionally tapped, you were physically tapped, you were cognitively tapped. So the thought of going home and doing anything other than panic applying for a few jobs on a particularly bad day, it's like, no, I just can't deal with it. Yes. So getting the energy is the big thing. So I'm a huge advocate for figuring out an after work reset. So how can I don't expect that anyone can come and just leave the bags at the door. But what you shouldn't do is what I did in my toxic job, where it was like, come in, complain to my husband and rant while I'm making dinner, stew on it for a while, like replay situations in my head and figure out different ways. No, okay, like if you need to have that relief, like if you just need to like trauma dump, make it contained, but then figure out, okay, how do I get to something that will make me feel better? Because unfortunately, ranting is like scratching a mosquito bite. It feels good at the moment, but it actually makes it itchier. So we need to stop doing that. Yeah. Or at least like I got like 2 scratches, you know?
Right.
Then actually, like, what can I do that will elevate my energy, will elevate my mood? So this is where we can look to like actual dopamine boosters, things like being outside, being in nature, going for a walk.
So what do you think are some effective strategies for dealing with a toxic coworker?
Oh, okay. So the first thing you need to do is you need to identify which toxic coworker you are dealing with, because I think that there's 7 different varieties. I have like a whole video on my YouTube channel about this.
Oh, good.
So knowing who you are up against is the first thing, because that's going to be the dynamic. Like, are you up against, you know, the person who's two-faced? Are you up against the nitpicker? Are you up against the person who's trying to sabotage you? Like, who are you actually dealing with?
Right.
Because not only then can you understand what drives them, it's also going to give you the ability to understand where the rub is and the right approach to deal with that person. So if you're dealing with someone who is, you know, the office gossip, but it's like malicious gossip and she's like all up in your business. Like, when you know you're dealing with that person, you can start to minimize your interactions. You can minimize the information that you give. You can find excuses to not talk to them. You can like have pre-prepared things that you say to redirect conversation when they corner you when you're grabbing a coffee. Like, you can find the skills and different strategies in order to neutralize that person as much as possible. But the first step is always understanding like who you were up against.
Right. Oh my gosh. Well, that's a lot.
Yeah.
Finding seven different things on your YouTube page. Okay, good.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Cause that is a lot. And then you just have to try to figure out who they are and
you know, humans gonna human. Like, human interactions is never going to be easy. And some people we work with and it's great and it's easy and like it's just so easy to build rapport. Some people not so much. And then, you know, just like how some people will immediately like be your advocates and allies, some people are going to be your adversaries, and that's just life.
Yeah.
And so learning how to deal with that when it comes up is going to set you up for success.
Yeah. Gosh. So, and maybe we kind of already touched on this, but so what are some steps that people can take to kind of move on and heal and get into their next workplace, you know, with a clean slate, not bringing any of this baggage?
Okay. So, and this can start even when you're in the toxic workplace. Because I think I talk to a lot of people who are like, I just need to get out first. Yes, absolutely. First, resolve to get out. But you can begin your toxic job recovery when you are still in the toxic job. In fact, it's going to make you more resilient in that job and minimize the harm that you experience.
Yeah.
The first thing is to understand what is actually happening. And I'm not talking about, oh, my boss, you know, yelled at me in front of the whole entire team. No, like, why was that toxic for you?
Yeah.
What is it actually like? What is your internal experience? What is coming up for you with this? Where else have you experienced this in your life? Like, we need to get crystal clear, because again, like, there is this tendency first to just keep it superficial level of they did this and that's what was toxic. But then there's also this tendency to externalize the experience. So like, I talk to so many people who have like diagnosed their boss with personality disorders, can tell me all about, you know, narcissistic personality disorder or their borderline or this is, you know, none of that is actually like, that's not, it's a problem, but it's not the problem, right? So we need to, instead of externalizing and psychoanalyzing the people around us, like, let's get into our own heads. Let's get into our own feelings and experiences and truly understand them. Because it's when you get to the root of these things and you start to understand the beliefs and the adaptions that are being created. Like, you need to get there so you can understand how this has changed your beliefs about who you are at work, who you are in general, what your potential is, what your capabilities are, as well as the ways that you have adapted not only your belief system, but your behaviors at work in order to undo the effects of the toxic workplace. The ultimate here is once you start to identify those, then you can start to like question, is this necessary and is this true? Because just because we believe something doesn't mean it's true. Like, headphones on to any kids in the room, but like, there's been, you know, certain people celebrated at certain, you know, holidays that we believe in as children that we know aren't real, right? So just because we believe something does not make it a fact. So can we fact check ourselves?
Right.
And then the most important piece, that's like how we start to move from, I have a recovery cycle. So awareness is where people will generally, I meet people when they're aware that they're in the toxic work dynamic. If they want to escape it and like avoid the toxic job loop where they end up staying in the toxic job or ending up in future toxic jobs, we need to get to release. So that's the pivotal. That's where that awareness starts to come in and fact checking yourself. But then to also not just end there, because that's going to get you like kind of back into like neutral.
Right.
Where we really want to get is back to like the positive, you're in control. So like, what do you actually want? What is really important to you? And getting to know yourself better through this process. So again, like one of the ways that we can avoid a toxic workplace, being super clear on what our values are and what that actually looks like at work. So that when we're interviewing, we can check companies that we're talking to about that. We know what questions to ask from our potential manager because we know what's important to us. And so the clearer that you can get, that puts you back into the position of power. And the more empowered you are, the more power you feel.
Love that. So one last thing, you know, so now they're empowered and they feel better and they're moving. Are there any red flags that they should look for that might stand out that maybe they don't know, but if you tell them these red flags, they might, you know, okay, yeah, I can't do that. I can't go here.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, something that happens after you've been in a toxic job is you're probably hyper vigilant to the warning signs. Like, you can spot them everywhere. You can spot them from a mile away. Again, this is just something that your brain does because now your brain is detecting danger. So the hardest part is to actually differentiate, is this a real red flag that I should be running from? Or is this just something that, you know, is hitting onto something that I've experienced and obviously want to avoid? Again, this comes down to, I think, getting the clarity on like, what do I really need at work? What is a positive and supportive work environment for me? Like, what does support look like? What does positive look like? What values are there? And, you know, it can start at the surface level, like being remote, being hybrid, which I know is like what most people want, even though companies are trying to drag us all back into the office. But also, again, like going deeper. So for me, like when it comes to a toxic work environment, I know that I can pretty much deal with anything as long as I have a good manager. So for me, that comes down to 3 things and 3 questions and criteria that I evaluate managers against. And this is for me, and I know it's resonated for a lot of people. But ultimately, it comes down to 1, how will you support me? Now, my growth. This does not always mean that you are providing me direct mentorship, training. Sometimes it's going to be connecting me with other people or giving me the opportunities to grow. Second is a willingness to help me remove barriers. So if something is in my way and I say I need help and I don't mess around, I'm not someone who's asking for help if I don't really need it.
Right.
What are you going to do as a leader to make my life easier, to like help me get through this problem instead of judging, shaming me for this problem and like having it become a bigger thing. So support my professional growth, help remove obstacles. And then third for me is stay out of my way. Unless I ask, I'm a person who has very high autonomy. So any level of management feels like micromanagement to me. Right. And again, I know this about myself. So I can have a very clear communication of like, if you are asking me anything about my work, I'm going to feel micromanaged. Right. But like, you know, obviously then we have to like work and negotiate different systems of communication and make sure like there's a flow of information and all of that stuff to still enable work to be productive. But then like are you going to allow me to do what I do and that I do very well, that you pay me money to do?
Right.
Or are you going to become an obstacle? So that's the three things that I always look at. And I know that those criteria have helped a lot of people. So I think that those are things that probably can help a lot of people. So hopefully it helps at least one person listening.
Yeah.
It does.
Wait, that's something else I need to touch on. Okay. So, I mean, even though a lot of people are going back, is there toxicity in remote work environments? You would think that there wouldn't be, but I bet there is tons.
There is. It looks different. And it's a little, remote workplaces enable you to hide it better.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
You know, it's not in your face. It's not as persistent. So in a certain way, it can actually make it more tolerable for more casual day to day. So for example, you know, there's probably less gossip in a distributed team, but at the same time, the isolation that remote work enables makes it very easy for you to be invisible. And again, when you're invisible, you can very quickly become a target for someone who sees an opportunity. And so, yes, there absolutely is still toxicity in remote places. The way that it looks is going to be different. But, you know, not going into an office, while that might be where you do your best work and are going to feel the best, it doesn't mean that you are going to completely escape workplace toxicity. Because again, anytime that we're working with humans going to human. Yep. Even if you leave and start your own company and you work for yourself from a home office, you still have clients who are humans. Yes. And these things still happen.
You can't get away from it 100%. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
No, unfortunately. And I mean, I'm like a socially anxious introvert, so if I could avoid it, I would have figured it out. And I would have told everyone about it.
Well, this has been very, very enlightening. So, and I'm so glad you agreed to come on. So if people want to get in touch with you, if they want to follow you, if they want to engage your services, how do they reach you?
Okay, so my website is probably the best spot to find me because it links to everywhere. So it's capdecasolutions.com. Or if you just want to get a weekly newsletter from me that deep dives into toxic workplace culture, surviving toxic workplace, getting over toxic workplaces, and getting your career trajectory back on track, my weekly newsletter is the Career Bestie Insider. And you can go to careerbestieinsider.com to sign up for free. And I will email you all my links to the socials and whatnot once you get on there.
Okay. Good. Follow her on YouTube and Instagram and TikTok.
All the places.
You've got huge followings there. Huge followings. So again, thank you so much. This was just invaluable. And I think so many people deal with this. So I really appreciate it. And I will see you back on the socials.
Thank you.
Thanks again for listening to the Office Latte podcast. You can find us anywhere you listen to your podcast. You can follow the podcast on Instagram and TikTok at Executive Resumes, or subscribe to our YouTube channel, Office Latte Podcast. If you have any career questions or conversations you want us to talk about, send them to officelattepodcast@gmail.com, and we'll answer them in an upcoming show. Have a great week and stay caffeinated.